What's that sound? It's for amusement only, the EM and Bingo Pinball Podcast.
Welcome back to For Amusement Only. This is Nick Baldridge. Tonight, I had an issue with Mystery, and I wanted to get that figured out. So Mystery is a game made by Exhibit Supply Company in 1947, and I've talked about it before in its own dedicated episode on the show, talking about the gameplay, but tonight I wanted to talk about a particular problem and how I resolved it. Mystery has a baffle that when you put a coin into the coin slide and push it in, it will push this baffle in, which will then actuate all of the trip relays which are underneath the playfield. As it does so, one of the trip relays that it hits, the next to last one, in fact, is labeled the reset relay. And what this does, when it's in the reset position, not the tripped position, it will send a signal into the back box to another relay, also marked reset relay. This one in the back box will start the score motor turning and will actually start ticking up the thousands stepper up to 10 times until it hits a 0 position on that. And it will also push in the reset plunger on both the 10,000 stepper and it will push the reset on the replay unit. Now, this game is missing several parts, and some of the parts are related to the replay unit. So, the replay unit itself is intact, which is good because the game cannot function without that replay unit. But it does not have, I don't think, the factory coin slide installed. There is a lockout coil, which does activate when there are replays on the register on the unit, but it does not actually pull the little clip allowing you to push in the coin slide without a coin in there. So that's one interesting thing. Another interesting thing is that on an interview with Charles Rowland that I did earlier this year, he talked about Exhibit games and how they had a piston which would push the baffle back in place. And I mentioned that my game didn't have this. Well, I took a much closer look at the baffle itself, and I see some interesting mounting holes, which I hadn't noticed before, but, you know, when your mind starts moving in a direction, it's hard to stop it sometimes. So, I think perhaps my game might have had this at some point, and it had been robbed from the game, you know, somewhere along the way. And so that is interesting, because the baffle right now will reset with the help of gravity. There is a sloped piece of metal and then a little plastic caster that rolls over this sloped piece of metal, and it just pushes it back into the default position. It essentially falls that way. Now, if you have the playfield lifted, say you're doing some work underneath the playfield, it's much harder for it to move because there's no gravity to help it along. So, at any rate, all this to say, you know, I'm noticing these things because that reset relay is down near the bottom of the trip bank, which again is under the playfield on the left-hand side and is reset by the baffle. So, what was happening is that the fuses for the coils were blowing. And it wouldn't happen instantly, but it would happen fairly quickly. Now, another interesting thing is that the fuse for the GI was also blowing. These fuses are right beside each other. There's only 3 fuses in the game. The third fuse is the primary fuse, so it fuses the transformer. Now, the coil fuse would blow because the game couldn't figure out that the thousands unit was on a 0 position. It also was getting a conflicting signal saying that, in fact, it was on a 0 position, and so it wouldn't attempt to step it from the position that it was on, and therefore it would leave the reset plungers for those other 2 units active. And so thankfully, before it burned the coils into a crisp, it blew the fuse. That's all good. Now, the initial jolt of power as you push in the baffle lights the lamps in the game very brightly for a brief period of time while it's completing the reset cycle. And because this reset cycle was not completing, the lamps were staying lit longer, brighter, and therefore it blew the GI fuse as well. At first I assumed the worst. I assumed that a coil was shorted to the lamp sockets somewhere, but after close inspection that was not the case. The other thing I did was try to isolate the problem by unplugging the playfield via the Jones plugs, and what I found in that case, the transformer's in the head, so you turn the game on and it will still turn on, and I was able to activate the reset relay in the head, and that worked appropriately. The signal to have those reset plungers active comes from the relay that's under the playfield. So at this point, I knew that there was an issue with this relay under the playfield and how it determined when it should trip. Well, here's where things get interesting. The schematic as it was written in 1947 does not include both reset relays. It only includes a single diagram for the reset relay. And the reset relay which is diagrammed is actually the one that's under the playfield, which is all well and good, except that there's interaction with the other reset relay which has to be taken into account. You can't ignore that one in favor of the other. But the normal startup sequence, when you push in the baffle, it resets that reset relay, and it will stay in the reset position until it determines that all of the steppers are in the 0 position, the 100,000s and the thousands. So, once it figures that out, it trips the reset relay that's under the playfield, and it no longer attempts to reset. And at that point, you can lift your balls to the playfield and shoot, and they will score appropriately. So, how did I fix it? Well, I took a close look at each of the steppers, the 100,000s and the thousands, and realized that the thousands had a rivet that had almost been worn away by arcing over time. Now, this is something I had noticed during my initial work on the game, but it had not been a problem previously. And so at this point, the switch has become marginal enough, that rivet has become marginal enough that it is a problem. So I gave it a nice cleaning and set it in place, but the long-term fix is going to be to put some silver solder in there with the rivet, and that will help create a larger surface area, and the silver solder will not wear away as easily as regular lead or lead-free solder. So I have not done this yet because the game is now functioning appropriately. Now I probably should, because the problem with a marginal rivet like this is that it's only going to get worse. And at some point enough of the contact face will be worn away that the rivet will become loose, and then the problem will be much, much worse than it is right now. But for now, the game is working. We have people coming over tomorrow, so I probably won't dive that deep into it. But I had another problem, and that is the 5000 relay was not scoring appropriately. Now, for listeners who've been listening for a long time, you'll remember that there was a switch on that relay which had given me problems in the past. And I fixed it with a dab of solder on one of the contacts that was spinning freely in the switchblade. I went ahead and switched out that switch, and that improved things. However, the 5,000 point relay was not firing when it should. Not all the time. It would do it occasionally. And so at this point, that's a symptom of another switch in the circuit not making, and it was time to whip out the schematic again. Took a look at the schematic, and the only thing in line was a motor switch. So the score motor in this game is actually directly to the left of the 5,000 point relay, also in the back box, and it's relatively simple. There's only about maybe a dozen switches on it. So this switch happened to be in the second stack on the bottom, and it was making, by all accounts. I asked it questions and it answered appropriately. It appeared to be making. Using a meter, I measured, and I've mentioned before how you can use a meter to test conductivity, but it won't tell you the whole story because you're only testing 9 volts of conductivity. Of course, it registered that it was conducting. Everything is great. But it wasn't. So I did an experiment. I held that switch closed with my finger, and much more firmly than it would otherwise, and then pressed the actuator on the 5,000 point relay. All good. So I verified that this is the problem, and at this point, I looked at the switch. It appeared clean. I went ahead and cleaned it. I adjusted it very tightly, and then started testing. And eventually, I got the switch into the position it needed to be in order to score appropriately. It was a very difficult thing to get that switch adjusted appropriately, especially because of just how packed in those switches are and how difficult it is to access. But eventually I prevailed, and everything's good. Mystery's working appropriately. Well, that's all for tonight. Thank you very much for listening. My name again is Nick Baldridge. You can reach me at foramusementonlypodcast@gmail.com, or you can call me on the Bingos line. That's 724-BINGOS1, 724-246-4671. You can listen to us on iTunes, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, via RSS, on Facebook, on Twitter at Bingo Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram, also at Bingo Podcast, or you can listen to us on our website, which is foramusementonly.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.